right, everybody. So we are demonstrating a couple of teaching techniques today. We're going to do three different, pretty small contained lessons. This first one is going to be about closures. So this is my lesson plan for this. My objective is by the end of this lesson, I hope that each and every one of you will be able to explain closures. For you teachers at home, the way that I'm going to assess this is I'm going to ask each of you to write an answer to that. And I'm going to gauge your understanding based off of that. So these are things that students do. These are things that instructors do. So I'm first going to ask you to brain dump everything you know about closures already. I'm going to read and assess those. I'm going to give you some examples and we're going to talk through those a little bit. And then I'm going to walk through, I'm going to have you try to walk through the execution of a block of code. And hopefully off of that, we're going to improve the answers a little bit from brain dump to the check for understanding. What questions do you have before we begin? All right, I'll take your silence as I'm champing at the bit and raring to go. So this is a tool that a colleague of mine built a long time ago. I haven't used this in years, but I think it's going to work really well for this. So I'm going to put the link in chat. So why don't you head over there, and I'm going to make a room called closures, plural. And so I want you to enter the closures room as well. And I should see you show up on the left side here. See Jalen, Jack, there's Will. See JR. There's Ben. And I think that's everyone. All right. Oh, no, we still need Tiffany.
Tiffany said she'll be right back.
Okay. Well, Tiffany can catch up. So I'm going to set this to text area. Ben, would you be so kind as to wiggle your fingers on the keyboard a little bit? All right. So I can see Ben typing in real time. That's the way that this tool works. Now, you should probably only be able to see yourselves, but I can click between these and see what people are typing. All right, so that's the setup on this. The first activity that I want you to do when following my lesson plan is I want you to brain dump for 3 minutes everything you know about closures. This isn't your like tight, concise answer. This is everything you think you know about closures. 3 minutes, go. Another 2 minutes. Tiffany, you are brain dumping everything you know about closures.
Where? To you through Slack?
In this everybody writes tool. So you can just type it in here like this. One more minute. Okay, so now what I want to do as a teacher, if I'm not using the Everybody Writes tool, maybe I'm asking everybody to Slack this to me or drop it in a thread or something like that. But as I'm reviewing through these answers, what I want to see is, are there things that everybody gets? Is there things that nobody's getting? What kind of range am I looking at? But before I start teaching, I want to know what I'm walking into. So when I look at Ben's answer, don't know very much about closures related to the scope of the variable. It is. Makes them persist even after a function is run. Correct. Ordinary local variables are disposed of from memory after a function runs. Also correct. Okay, so like that's not a comprehensive answer to that, but it's not nothing. So we're probably about halfway there on that one. But look at Jack's. Closure is when you have a variable, function, or object located in a higher scope than your current working environment. So like current working environment, I'm not sure if I like that phrasing, but I'm going to file that one away. And you're able to reference that variable or function or object and nice, Jack, in a lower, more narrowed scope. Just give me an example. Global DOM variable at the top of a scope, reference that in a function. Yes, that's accurate. Access an outer function scope using closure. Like also true. So like this one, like I'd say is mostly correct. We're really just kind of wrestling with some vocabulary on that. All right, so Jalons. Closures are functions that wrap functions within functions so you can use a variable across the function. No, this is good. So we've got a, oh, that's right, I can't type in yours. So we have a function inside of a function over here, and we are referencing this inside of this and then returning it. It's a good example of a closure. Look at juniors. Functions inside of themselves that call on the outer function deals with scope. That's also like in the neighborhood. Look at Tiffany's. Function that returns another function. That is often how closures are implemented. It's not necessarily a closure. This is always the case. Yes, and that's the case. And so if I look at Will's, closure provides persistent local variable scope. Cool. So what I'm taking away from all of these answers as a teacher is like, I don't need to start at ground zero. I can actually kind of start in the middle. And that's probably a better use of our time. So if I'm going back to my lesson plan, now I want to go through some concrete examples of this. So looking at this example here, I want you to think about where the closure is. Think to yourself for a second. I'm going to call on somebody. Tiffany, where's the closure in this?
Inside the some function.
Yep. What part of it?
Some parameter.
Ooh, interesting. Why do you think that?
So actually, yes, no. Some variable. I'm going to change that. And I think that because you've declared some variable above and you're accessing it inside of some function.
Yes. Cool. So that's a correct answer. And furthermore, as a teacher, what I got out of Tiffany's answer is I got to see her thought process a little bit. And so there's some confusion about parameters versus closures. And so I'm filing that away in my head as like, I'll bet she's not the only one. We could probably like dive into that a little bit more. But otherwise, like we got to a correct answer. Some variable is the closure there because it's referencing that outer scope. A pause there. Why don't you ask me some questions about this?
I definitely have one.
Okay.
Is it called hoisting? I think is it hoisting. That's something similar to this. They're kind of related. Yes.
So hoisting is actually unrelated to this. Hoisting is the fact that I'm using some function here, and this will still work if I put the function definition there. I can use a function before I've declared it in the code. That's hoisting. Other
So
questions about this?
I have a question about, I guess, verbiage.
Yeah.
So the closure is happening on, at this point, line 2.
Let me turn off my relative numbers. There you go.
Yeah, thanks. On line 4,
Uh-huh.
specifically, some variable is where some variable on line 4 is where the closure is occurring, but
Yes.
it's not line 1. That doesn't have anything to do with it other than that's the point that's being referenced.
You are correct.
And its closure is occurring at some variable.
Yes, you're saying that some function has closed over some variable because I'm referring to it in here.
Perfect. So inner scope has closed over outer scope.
Correct. Other questions? Cool. So if I do this, everything still works the same. If I run it, it still runs. This is not a closure. Why not? Think to yourself, why is that not a closure? Mr. Dunn, what you got?
Because you could no longer access some variable outside of that function, like after it runs.
Cool. Pause for a sec. So teacher brain is going, so that's going to be a point of contention because that's part of like the definition that, especially for like interviewing and stuff we teach, being able to reference something after a function is complete doesn't really apply in this specific scenario. So I'm thinking like, okay, cool. I got to tease that part of it out. All right, back into like actual lesson. So not quite. Who can help Ben out with why this isn't a closure?
I have an idea.
All right, hit me.
Is it because some variable is now like just locally scoped within the function?
Bingo. That's why. We're only dealing with one scope here, hence no closure. So now I want to go back to Ben because Ben's understanding on this was a little bit shaky. So I want to make sure that's firm before I move on. Ben, explain this back to me.
I'm not positive I did follow it. It's a good thing you circled back to me.
All right, awesome. I'm glad I did too. So in the previous example, there's actually two scopes happening here. And let's draw this out because it's not, especially the way that I did this here, it's not immediately obvious. So the shape of pretty much all closures is we have some outer scope and some inner scope. And there's something out here that we're referencing in here. Outer scope, inner scope. This thing is in this scope, we're using it in here. That's a closure. So applied to this, the thing that's slightly confusing about this is what's the outer scope in this scenario? Volunteer, anybody?
That
Everything outside the function.
Yep. There's a special name for that scope.
Global?
Global. Our global scope is the outer scope. And this function has its own scope. That's the inner one. So in the example that we have here, the outer scope is our global scope, and this is some function. So since we declared this variable out in the global scope and we're using it in some function, we're saying the sum function has closed over that part of the global scope. Personally, I always visualize this kind of like, this thing is here. I imagine like it's a little loop that like, zoop, just sort of like swallowed that up. All right, so now I want to go back to Ben, check Ben's understanding. Why is this a closure, but this is not?
Gotcha. Because there's nothing affecting this function in the outer scope. It's all
Yeah.
contained in one scope.
Bingo. Very good answer. So that would be like if I had something in this scope and then I'm referencing it in the same scope later. That's not a closure. Other questions about this idea so far?
So based on that explanation, what you're saying is if it's local, there's no closure. There needs
Correct.
to be two different levels of scopes in order for it to be closure.
Bingo. And this always goes in one direction. We're always like closing over our outer scope. Why would that not work the other direction? Think to yourself for a sec. Why are we always closing over an outer scope? You can't close over an inner scope. That doesn't make any sense.
Is it because the outer scope doesn't know what's inside of it?
Bingo.
So the inner, it's almost like the box, like the inside box knows its outer contents, but the outer contents doesn't know its inner contents.
Ding, 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 ding. That's why we can't close over our inner scopes. We don't know what they are. We always know our outer scopes. We never know our inner scopes. And the reason we know our outer scopes is because of
Closures.
closures.
This concept, though, as you've explained it to me, I know they've called it closures, but I almost envision it more like an expansion, like
Sure.
from the most narrow scope, and it just like hulks out and swallows everything else up as it goes.
Yes, it is a little bit like that. I'm going to show you an example in a sec of how this is still constrained in some way. But yes, otherwise you're correct. Other questions about this idea so far? Okay, so if I go back to my lesson plan, so we've gone through examples, we've ID'd examples, we've circled back a couple times using some live assessment. Some of that we did with the Everybody Writes tool. Some of this we were doing just by talking. Both of those are kinds of assessment. I'm trying to figure out what they know, what they're struggling with, so that I can tailor the instruction specifically to that. The next step here is walking through a code execution. So this is something I want students to do, and I'm going to try to guide them through it. So what I mean by this is I want to talk line through line. You're going to pretend to be a compiler and figure out what is happening on these 7 lines of code. And so let's do this round robin style. I want to get some more people involved. Junior, why don't you, what's happening on line 1, like in human terms?
You're setting some variable to equal the string high.
Cool. So I've got a little like placeholder variable that we can use later in the execution. Tiffany, what is this line doing?
You are defining a function called some function
Yep.
and passing in an argument called some parameter.
Careful on that. So like answers half right. Who can help Tiffany like tighten up the language on that?
I can.
Cool.
All right, try. So whenever you're defining the function, you're referring to the parameter.
Yep.
Whenever you're invoking the function, what you pass to the parameter is the argument.
Bingo. So some parameter is the parameter, oi is the argument. So Tiffany, give that another shot. What's
Yeah.
happening on this line?
So in line 3, you are defining a function called some function and passing in a parameter called some parameter.
Close. There's one other tweak that we need to make on this. So we're not passing in the parameter.
Or requiring a parameter called some parameter.
You're on the right track. It's not required though. We're saying that it,
It takes in
yes,
a
bingo.
parameter called some parameter.
Exactly. We're declaring a function that takes in a parameter, and we're just going to refer to it as some parameter inside that scope. Questions about that idea? So pause for a sec, teacher brain. So anytime a student like is a little bit shaky on something, chances are they're not the only one. So like if that wasn't just a fast answer, that's a little trigger to me that like maybe we need to spend just a little bit more time on this. So any other questions come up about this? Cool. Moving on. William, tell me what's happening on this line.
On line 4, you are console logging the, so you're printing to the console the values of some parameter and some variable. That's what the code block does.
Cool. That's what the code block does, but it's not doing this. When the compiler is going through this, it doesn't see this and start logging something. What's the
Okay.
what's the catch on that?
So it's not, I guess it's not so much that it's, we're printing it to the console at that point. We're giving it the instructions
Yes.
there on, yeah.
Bingo. So it's really just part of this definition still. Whenever this runs, I want you to do these things. Cool. Mr. Dunn, please explain line 7 to me.
We are calling some function
Mhm.
and passing it the argument oi, a string.
Bingo. So, Mr. Higger, would you be so kind as to walk us through what's happening after that?
When you call some function of oi, when you call it on the argument oi, that console log will grab some parameter from the parameter
Mhm.
provided in the function, and it will grab some variable from the outside scope. In that way, that variable is sort of it's creating a closure because that function is invoked with some variable at a particular point in the runtime.
Bingo. Great answer. So,
Sweet. I had salad in my teeth.
yeah, in your mouth and all over the place. So, yes, all that's accurate. Questions about this so far before we get wild with it?
I just wanted to clarify. So JavaScript runs the file twice. Is that right? Does it read it and then it goes back through and it runs it? Or
Correct. That's how hoisting works. So
Okay, perfect.
really, like, this gets read immediately before even like this first line runs.
Okay.
Not super important for this, but yes, that's true.
Yeah, I was just asking in context to like when Will was describing line 4.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions about anything we just talked through? Okay, here's where this is going to get wild. And hopefully, like, you get a better idea of why closures are powerful. So if, let's say I make another file, it's app.js, and this is going to be a module. So I'm going to module.exports some function. And then over here, I'm going to require that in. And then I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm just going to invoke the file, pass it in. Does it work? There it is. It's the same thing that we just did, but check that out. We're not even in the same file anymore. When I run this, it still has hi. Let's go through this one really slow. When I bring this in, it's going to look through this file. It's going to run all this stuff. It's going to do all the things that we just talked about. And then this file is donezo. It's just been read in, and all I did was export out this function so that I can use that somewhere else. This scope is over as soon as this line is done. All I have is some instructions saved away. But when I run those instructions, it remembers that that was there because it closed over it. Pause for brain explosion. I pulled in a function definition here. That function definition remembers the scope that it was defined in. I still haven't called it yet. I haven't actually done anything, but it remembers that there was something in its scope called some variable, and it was set to high. And now it's got that all locked down. And so when I run this, it can use that variable. Ask me some questions about that.
So this is because it's still stored in the memory. It
Yes.
decides, hey, cool, I'll keep that.
Bingo. And like more specifically, it's stored along with this function definition. So this function definition just got a little bit chubbier.
Does some function know that it came from closure.js, or does it think, since it's been written in, that it's now part of app.js's global scope?
It doesn't care.
Okay.
It doesn't know that it came from closures.js. It doesn't care where it is now. All it cares about is it, in its definition, needed something that wasn't in its scope, and so it copied it over into its scope. It closed over it.
Is it wrong to think of closures as like instantiating a function?
That will probably not lead you down a helpful path. Other questions
Yeah.
about this idea?
you couldn't then change some variable from this, right? Because it's closed the other one and it's bringing it from the other place. So you couldn't like define anything here for that.
Correct. I don't have any method to. Now, like, you could conceivably have something that is altering this thing that I closed over if, for example, this thing returned another function that set some variable to word. I could change it that way. But unless I've given some mechanism for doing that, nope, it is locked in. And so this is how functional programmers do private variables. It's the exact same concept in OOP. If I don't make a setter for something, you can't change it. If I don't make a getter for something, you can't read it directly. That doesn't mean no other methods can read it. This is the exact same idea in functional programming. Cool. So teacher brain right now is going like, all right, we have explored this from a couple different sides. I've heard from a lot of people. I feel like I've surfaced some misunderstanding. And I do have another thing that I want to show with closures, but it's not important to me that you be able to replicate it because it's not our objective. Being able to explain closures is not the same as being able to like use closures creatively or whatever else. So I do want to like stoke curiosity with like the cool things you can do with closures. Before I move on from that, I want to make sure that like the things we've already talked about, I want to just get a temperature check on where we're at with it. So I want to go for the written response. I want to check for understanding now. So we're going to go back to everybody writes, delete whatever you had before. And scenario is you're at a terrible party full of a bunch of jerks and all everybody wants to talk about there is closures. So they go, hey, you, why don't you explain to me what a closure is? What are you going to tell them? Let's take another couple minutes on that. Go. Higgs and Jack, if you go to this URL, it's Everybody Writes Heroku app. Just go to that and then go to the closures room. And anything you type, I can see in real time.
Are we trying to make an example or are we trying to just explain it? Oh, never mind.
So now I'm thinking about, all right, where are we at time-wise? So I'm going to start looking at people's things, see who's typing. People are still typing, so I've got another minute on the timer. I'm just going to let it go. Hey, Sylvie.
Hi, friends.
Okay, so now I want to take a look at some answers. So I'll have a look at Ben's. Cool. That's a pretty solid execution, or a pretty solid explanation. If you look at Jack's, this is a great definition. Excellent. Cool. And like, this is mostly correct, but this is exactly the thing that I want to kind of demonstrate on our way out. Is that there's like pseudo private methods. That was like the original ES5 era, like hot use of closures. Tucking stuff away in files, like that's pretty good too. But there's one other major use case. It's also like very related to FP. All right, very nice. This is great. Terrific answer. Terrific answer. Terrific answer. Awesome. So now I'm fairly confident that everybody in this lesson has like demonstrated mastery of our objective, which was explaining closures. And that's how you can use real-time assessment to help actually drive the progress of a lesson. All right, so there's one more thing that I wanted to show. There's two reasons for this. One is that this is all well and good and helps you with the vocab word. It doesn't so much help you with like why closures are badass. And like Jack had some of the things in there, but there's another like really powerful use case for this. So the other reason that I want to demo this is to keep you curious about this concept. If you can walk out of a lesson like just craving more, that's a very positive thing for your brain. So imagine, all right, I'm going to get rid of all this. Don't need it. Don't need it. Another cool thing you could do would be something like, imagine we're mapping over something and I want to do something like, I've got an array of objects and they have IDs and they have names. And I want to map over this and turn this into something that gets everybody's names out. So like nothing too crazy about this so far, but if you guys have seen me do these things, you know, boy howdy, do I hate inline functions. So like I could extract this function out into its own standalone thing. I might call it like get name. And it takes in a person and returns person.name. All right. So I can just swap that out. Nice. And so now I'm using that, that first class function there for that. Now here's where this gets tricky. let's say that I want one function that can get the name or get the ID. Like maybe it takes it in as an argument. How would I do that? Because if I do like something like that, well, now I'm invoking the function. And map takes a function definition. Can anybody put together the Lego pieces on how I could use Clojure to solve this problem? Think to yourself for a sec. I'm going to call on somebody. Jack Sanders, any ideas on how I can use? I saw your face.
My brain was going, don't call me. Please don't call me the entire time. I wasn't thinking. I was just saying that in my head. No idea.
Cool. Mr. Hager, any ideas? Oh, he's got
I
a
think
mouth-
I know exactly what you want, but I don't know what you're asking for because I was answering a question on
Oh,
DTQ.
fair enough.
So what is
All
the
right,
question?
I'll just give it to you. So
Anonymous function, I'm guessing, because I came in for the tail end of it.
So if I did something like that, I could make this function get and have this, call this like property or something.
Oh, got you.
And then return a function definition that takes in a person.
Yep.
And returns person at property. That works. And I can even compose those and do something like, I can make a function called getName that is getName. And now, I don't even have that ugliness. That's functional programming. That's the cool stuff that you can like actually apply with closures. So it's not important to me that you can do that right now. I am thrilled beyond measure that all of you were able to explain closures. So any last thoughts, hate mail, questions before we move on to the next one? Going once. Going twice. Sold. Each and every one of you has done an outstanding job. So the thing we're going to do next is we're going to go through writing unit tests in Mocha. Now, I want to do a little bit of palate cleansing. So let's take 5 minutes, bio break, forget about closures. We're going to do unit testing next. Hang tight. 5 minutes. Let's get the music back on.